Alrighty. Uh, Tasha, I think you're on deck.
I guess it would help if I unmute myself. Next slide, please. Next. A time comes when silence is betrayal. A time comes when silence is betrayal. Who said this and when? Anybody? You can just unmute yourself and shout out your answer.
Yeah, Dr. King, I think.
Yes, yes. Okay. So is this statement true today? A time comes when silence is betrayal. What about Gaza? Are we funding genocide in Gaza? Next slide, please. Genocide in Gaza is made in the good old USA. Billions of US taxpayers' dollars are being sent every year to fund the Israeli military. American bombs fired from American aircraft killing civilians in Gaza, the majority of whom are women and children. And despite the horrifying images and stories that are being shared on social media and also maybe in the mainstream news, our government officials at the highest level are providing diplomatic cover for war crimes. Next. On April 4th, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King made his Beyond Vietnam speech. In his Beyond Vietnam speech, Martin Luther King calls out the US government as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he spoke about how the US had to make a choice between pursuing endless war or pursuing an end to poverty. How we had to choose between money for college education, student loan debt relief, affordable housing, Medicare for all, versus manufacturing and using weapons. So in his speech, he calls out war as the enemy of the poor. And these are his words. I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and attack it as such. Exactly 1 year later to the day, Dr. King was assassinated. Next. They got money for war, but can't feed the poor. These are lyrics that Tupac Shakur, the hip hop artist in the early 1990s, wrote these lyrics 25 years after Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech. And these words are still true today. So I took a screenshot of a video that was circulating on social media of a billboard truck in Dearborn, Michigan, that's driving around between hospitals in Dearborn. And so, as you can see, the sign says, can't afford healthcare? Sorry, gotta give Israel billions to bomb children. Did you know that medical debt is the leading cause of bankruptcy in the US? That the majority of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck? In Seattle, you can easily see that homelessness is on the rise. And unfortunately, it's not just Seattle, it's all over the country. And we have to make a connection between our falling living standards and militarism and the money that is spent on endless war. Next.
So a question for the room, and we can take two responses here. How does militarism stop us from addressing social ills?
Your replies are encouraged, folks, please.
Joe Bergson.
It's institutionalized in the military-industrial complex. I mean, it's our system. It's very deep, and it's very hard to disentangle. That's the first thought that occurs to me.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah. Anybody else want to take a stab at this question?
I think Vicky has her hand up.
Vicky, go ahead.
Well, I think since, the lobbyists, they have a very, very strong lobby, and it's difficult to, with, I'm sure, a huge amount of money. And so it's difficult to break through that.
Absolutely. And I'll break my own rule, and Mary will take one more.
Yeah, I think that what's happened in my lifetime is that social ills, especially in the Black community, are not addressed. And so young people who are suffering under all these social ills look to the military as a way out. And then you have like the 3 soldiers that were killed over on some base, like in Syria. I mean, so the militarization, the military as the solution and as the way of decreasing the pressure on the system for justice, I think is something we don't address enough.
Absolutely. The poverty draft. So for a brief land acknowledgement, so we acknowledge that we were on the colonized lands of the Coast Salish people, and that the colonial weapons of capitalism, anthropocentrism, militarism, and white supremacy are still at large, and they're wreaking havoc on indigenous communities around the globe. As nuclear weapons abolitionists, we acknowledge that indigenous communities from the Congo, Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Marshall Islands, all the way to the Spokane Nation here in Washington State, bear the extreme consequences of nuclear weapons from mining to testing, and represent a nuclear war that has already happened. As we commit ourselves to the abolition of nuclear weapons, so too must we commit ourselves to the abolitions of the systems of oppression that they are the ultimate product of and serve to defend. So who are we? I'm Sean Arendt, the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program Manager for the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I coordinate the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition, of which our other guests are members. Joanne, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Joanne Dufour. I live in Lacey, Washington, and I'm a member of the Olympia Coalition to abolish nuclear weapons. And I've had a blog on YouTube on disarming our planet.
Excellent. And Kathy?
Hi, I'm Kathy Railsback. I'm the volunteer resident activist at the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action in Poulsbo, Washington.
Excellent. Gu?
Hi, I'm Gu at KPNGN, Korea Peace Now grassroots network in Pacific Northwest chapter as co-coordinator. and also is working for the Seattle Evergreen Coalition for Korean Americans around this greater Seattle area.
Tasha?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tasha Essen, and I'm a co-coordinator along with Gu Lee with Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network in the Pacific Northwest chapter. Thank you.
So the Washington Against Nuclear Weapons Coalition is made up of over 60 organizations around the state in every congressional district. Our intention is to use these organizations to bring pressure on their members of Congress, district by district, in some cases town by town. We're peace groups, we're climate groups, we're anybody who recognizes that it's insane to spend $2 trillion on rebuilding our nuclear arsenal, and that nuclear weapons have always been an existential threat.
Hi, I'll go ahead and start. Next, please. So regarding our name, we're the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, and there are kind of two definitions I'd like to look at today of ground zero, the phrase ground zero. One is the point on the Earth's surface directly above or below an exploding nuclear bomb. And the second is a starting point or base for some activity. And I, of course, prefer the second. This is a picture of a mushroom here at ground zero. Next. So I want to address just the basic question, like why should people care about nuclear weapons today? And there is a lot of discussion now increasingly on militarism and opposition to militarism. And to me, nuclear weapons really represent militarism at its most extreme and grotesque. It's an incredible waste of money, hundreds of billions or up to trillions of dollars, and harm to people and the environment in the past based on the testing and the development of the weapons that we still are spending hundreds of billions to remedy. Damage to the environment in the present, and also, of course, the potential for devastating accidents in the future. Next. So now, why choose nonviolence? Ground Zero has been committed to promoting nonviolence, and nonviolence is a remarkable way to deal with violent and unjust situations. Traditionally, people will look at kind of either a violent response to violence or inaction, doing nothing. But there is a different way. You don't have to resort to either of those choices. There is a way to resist violence and injustice creatively and courageously. And it's been used by and tested by courageous people worldwide. It chooses love instead of hate, and constructive instead of destructive ways to deal with anger, so that the anger doesn't consume you or the person who's upset about the injustice and violence, so it doesn't consume you or your opponent. And really, the idea is the creation of the beloved community in which you and your opponent can thrive and live in peace and mutual security. Next. So this is a picture of our center, our lovely center in Poulsbo. Next. This is where we're located. We're 17 miles west of the Space Needle. And most people to get here take either the Edmonds-Kingston ferry or the Bainbridge Island ferry, or drive kind of around through Tacoma. Next. So the history of our center is that in 1975, a nuclear weapons engineer, Bob Aldridge, realized that he and his colleagues were designing weapons that could be used offensively, and he warned peace activists. He had kind of a moral crisis, and he warned people that he knew, peace activists in Canada, about plans to bring nuclear-armed submarines to the Pacific Northwest. Activists in the area along the coast joined with others in the world in the Pacific region who were seeking a nuclear-free Pacific. They started a nonviolent campaign to block nuclear-armed subs from coming to Washington. they purchased this property where I am right now. It's 3.8 acres next to the Trident submarine base to more effectively protest what was happening, what the Navy was planning. Unfortunately, they were not successful in stopping the nuclear weapons from coming to Washington, and the first submarine arrived in 1982. Next. So we have always had, since our founding, had a philosophy of nonviolence and the need to create the beloved community and to look at systemic violence, the kind of violence that would lead a society to create a weapon, to create a nuclear weapon. So we've always focused on different types of oppression, people based on race, age, or sex, and just a recognition that we need to look at all forms of violence, including violence within ourselves. Next. So here's a photo of an early rally in 1982 in the region, and it was held on August 8th, and we continue to have events or larger events in August around the dates of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Next. So we continue to do protests on land, on the water, in court. We do ads in newspapers. Hundreds of people have been arrested protesting at the gates. We do leafleting, and we have speakers come to groups. We do bus ads and billboards like the one shown. Next, and we send out a newsletter too, if people can let us know if they'd like to be on the newsletter list. This is a picture of a protest on the water, and then below shows some of the support from the religious community. This was Archbishop Hunthausen offering communion at a protest. And I think he was he was actually on the base inside the fence. Next. This is the famous fence at the end of our property, and one of our traditions is for visitors to come, and we'll hang peace cranes there on the fence. We also plant sunflowers there by the fence. Next. This is a photo of people before they were arrested, blocking the gate in last August. Next. And people don't have to get arrested. I make that clear. You know, some often do choose, but many choose not to, but just to be there as a witness. This is a group preparing to go to the gate, which is just 0.7 miles. So typically we'll walk for our demonstrations. We always review our nonviolence principles before we go. Next. So we continue to advocate for nuclear weapons abolition. We do training in nonviolence and peacekeeping. We have movie nights and potlucks because we're trying to build a community and show really a different way of living besides relying on intimidation and fear, such as we see through the threat of nuclear weapons. So we like to be a hub. We welcome people for retreats here. Next. So this is our intern, Ava Barabbas, watching Speaker Medea Benjamin of Code Pink during a program when she came to speak here in last year. Next. This was just earlier this month with Ben Jones leading a peacekeeper training for related to the Palestinian Solidarity Group. Next. This is Rachel Hoffman and Robin Naroon from the Marshallese Women's Association speaking about the testing in the Marshall Islands and the terrible consequences from that, and with the focus on nuclear injustice that as Sean mentioned earlier. Next. These are our lovely grounds. We do have a beautiful forest and trails, which is wonderful psychologically, you know, as a break compared to the weapons next door. So I've learned a lot about, or I've seen a lot of mushrooms, probably about 20 kinds here. Next. We get donated artworks, which we very much appreciate. Next. So this is kind of the layout. Ground zero is in the oval at the bottom of the screen, and then the bunker where the nuclear weapons are stored underground is in the middle. and again, about 1.4 miles from where I'm sitting right this moment. And then we've got the Trident Pier up there, the Delta Pier. Next. So a few facts: there are 8 nuclear attack submarines that are based here at Bangor. The base houses more than 1,000 nuclear warheads, and we just recently confirmed that we have the distinction of having the largest number of deployed nuclear weapons, that is kind of ready to use warheads in the world. If we were a country, we'd have the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. It's protected by, in part, by Navy-trained dolphins and sea lions there. Next. So they're enormous. The subs are enormous, 560 feet long, and each one holds 20 missiles. And each of these missiles, in turn, can hold like up to 8 warheads. And the explosive power is mind-boggling. The biggest bombs will carry 455 kilotons of explosive, and compared to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which was 14. So each sub has about 90 nuclear weapons on them. There's the pier with the submarines alongside. Next. This is the underground bunker. Next. So the trucks will come in on the right, I believe, and go down underground and where the weapons are stored, and then come out on the other side. Next. So this is another part of our center. This is an illustration of the Pacific Northwest Peace Pagoda, which is under construction on the property, also by the fence, and it's being constructed by the Nipponzan Miyahoji order. And it would be one of dozens of, I think, scores of peace pagodas around the world. Next. This is Reverend Senji Kaneda at one of our demonstrations at the gate, and he's been kind of leading the construction efforts there. Next. This was a quote from one of our early newsletters about kind of internal peace and working towards internal peace as well as external peace. Next. So this was a gathering in August, at our August, Senji Kaneda and Nipponzan Miyahoji, they lead a peace walk, so which people are welcome to join. And also there's one over on the Seattle side too, generally. So this is an illustration of how long the Trident, kind of coincidentally, the submarine happens to be exactly about the length of our property. But to me, this illustration really represents kind of a contrast between like how we want to be in the world, what our choices are. Do we want to be kind of focused on creating harmony and serenity in our lives and in the world? Or do we want to kind of rely on force and threat of violence and intimidation? So we would welcome anybody joining us. This is one of our sunflowers that we planted along with the pollinator. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. We'll have time for questions at the end for folks. Hopefully, we'll see. All right, go into Tasha.
Okay, next. Peace activist and scholar KJ No recently referred to the Korean War as Gaza with snow. The Korea Peace Now grassroots network stands in solidarity with Palestinian people because Koreans have experienced occupation and genocidal violence as well. During the Korean War, the US employed a scorched earth policy, dropping 635,000 tons of bombs on the country. Approximately 1/5 of the population was killed. And as KJ No wrote, you can take the unimaginable, atrocious barbarity of the bombing of northern Gaza and then double the intensity of that bombing, magnify the theater of bombing 800-fold, then add snow, and then you have the Korean War. Next. When did the, oh, actually, I thought I changed the slide because we originally did this slide presentation in person. But anyway, when did the Korean War end? It's a multiple choice question, and anyone can, you can raise your hand or you can just shout it out. And was it in 1950, 1953? Never? None of the above, or both B and C? Anyone who hasn't attended the presentation already?
See,
C, never. Okay, that's a yeah, C, okay. Anybody else? Any other guesses? Colleen said C, good.
I say C.
C,
I say C too.
yeah,
I say E.
E, both B and C. Yeah, I mean, because there was an armistice signed in 1953, a ceasefire, which stopped the active hostilities, and a peace agreement was supposed to follow, but that has never been signed. So technically, we are still in a state of war on the Korean Peninsula. Okay. All right, next.
Hi, so I'm Gu again from KPNGN, Pacific Northwest. I found very interesting photo throughout my research for this presentation. As you may see here, this is rally held in 1971 on the day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, after 3 years after his assassination. But it was held in Paju. Have anybody recognized the location, the Paju? It is located in South Korea. Then why is those gentlemen had rally over there? So next slide. To know that, as I briefly kind of tell you about the history in Korea. 1910 is Korea occupied by Japan. In 1945, these notorious 2 atomic bombs dropped in Japan, and then Korea liberated. But unfortunately, we separated as North and South. Before this liberation, Korea was the one. In 1950, Korean War began. And then, as Tasha said, 1953 is an armistice signed. And then right after a week after this armistice, MLK gave a sermon to these people in the US regarding peace and also mentioning Korean War. And then that's why since then in Korea, US Army stationed. Then 1971, those soldiers had rally for the very first time in Korea. That's the link between Martin Luther King and Korea very first time. Next slide. As mentioned, is the history, the nuclear history and Korea is very closely related. First, test of Trinity in 1945, first atomic bomb dropped on August 6th to Hiroshima. And 3 days after, to Nagasaki, Fat Man dropped, which was manufactured using plutonium produced in Hanford, Washington. And as mentioned before, August 15th, 1945, Korea liberated but separated right after, North and South. Next slide, please. During the Korean War is 1950 start, and still there's nuclear threat. Korea is supposed to be the 3rd city or 2nd nation victimized by atomic bombs. It's in 1950, Harry Truman had decided whether to use B-29s to drop atomic bombs to Korea. And also he even deployed this strategy and also nuclear bombs to Japan, very close to Korea, to end the war. Next slide. This is the actual paper of his Korean Armistice Agreement. As Tasha mentioned, it was signed July 27th, 1953. But here is a very small letter there. 3 months after armistice, supposed to withdraw all foreign forces from Korea and then peaceful settlement for its Korea peace. But unfortunately, never happened. And then signed still effective, but signed by US as UN Command and China and DPRK. Even as South Korean, I had no right to ask our government to sign. Keep make a promise for a peaceful settlement, because South Koreans never signed. Next slide, please. And about a week after, it's August 7th, 1953, MLK gave a sermon, First Things First. He focused on is against the imperialism, economic exploitation, and colonialism. So even the temporary letters in Korea is for from an assurance of peace. A truce is not a peace. Yes, we signed this armistice, cease the fire, but still the war is not ended. So still is very urgent and then dire situation, especially nowadays. Next slide. Yes, a truce is not a peace. Post-Korean War, nuke in the Korean Peninsula still existing. New evidence on origins of US deployment is tactical nuclear weapons from 1958 through 1991. And North Korea is heavily bombed and then nothing left. And then also had a lot of nuclear threats. They start developing their own nuclear weapons. And then eventually 2016, they had, and then successfully they had one. There's another threat to this Korean Peninsula, but also this entire globe to the people. Next slide, please. The current situation on Korean Peninsula is highly militarized situation in both North and South Korea, cause still war is not ended. And because of unresolved war, active fighting could break out at any time. Even recent North Korean government announced that now clearly South Korea is #1 enemy. Anything happened, then they start war. Military tensions are escalating, military exercises. So every year, through the year, but mainly March and August, there are 2 big US and ROK military war drills in Korea. But from last year, even Japan is joined together. So it's very dangerous and imminent threat from this March, because still they are planning to military exercise in South Korea. And the new trilateral alliance, US, South Korea, and Japan. And possibility of new nuclear arms race on the peninsula, as mentioned before. So North Korea keep testing some other nuclear weapons, and heavy American presence that could be characterized as an occupation. Nowadays, about close to 30,000 US soldiers stationed in Korea. So here the map, there is a big 16 US military base in South Korea, many more. But one of them, Camp Humphrey, recently they moved, but that's this world's largest US military overseas base. Mentioned before, about 28,000 US troops in 16 bases, and then US taxpayers pay $5 billion to the military in Korea. Even Korean people also use their tax money the subsidize is 45% of cost sharing for the US Army under this situation. Next slide, please. And this one tells the US government spent much more money. It's combination of 10 next countries together, still less than US only spending for this military and defense, especially strengthening US posture in the Indo-Pacific region against this China, also Russia and North Korea. So this strategy is kind of more visible regional presence, which means more nuclear and war drills and also nuclear deterrence. So even they deployed this nuclear armed submarine from here to Korea last year. So this is very urgent and then dire situation. So that's why it's currently we have some meeting in Korea. And also recently atomic scientists announced that doomsday clock set 90 seconds to midnight. It's the same as 2023, but it does not mean stabilized. Still kind of there's more threats. That's why they kind of set 90 seconds. So we have to keep working to kind of abolish any nuclear threats. Next, maybe back to Tasha.
Thank you, Gu. So, Gu and I are both part of the Korea Peace Now grassroots network, and we're working on a global campaign to end the Korean War. And our organization is led by feminists, and we're organizing, educating, and advocating for a formal end to the Korean War. You can find us on social media and or use the QR code to get more information. And next slide. We have ongoing efforts to advocate for legislation for a peace agreement. Last year, Brad Sherman introduced a bill, HR 1369, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, which would require the State Department and Congress to actively engage in diplomacy with North Korea for the purpose of ending the war. And unfortunately, that's not happening right now. In case you didn't know, two of our local congressional representatives, Marilyn Strickland in Tacoma and Pramila Jayapal in Seattle, have been co-sponsors of this legislation and generally supportive of our efforts. Join us in working to end the longest running war in US history. Thank you. Next.
Thank you, Tasha. All right.
Well, I
Joanne?
guess it's my turn, and I wanted to thank you all for your attention and your joining us this evening. I wanted to look about the concept of disarming our planet. That was the name of my blog. But really what we're talking about is making nuclear weapons not only illegal, but not around, eliminated, banned, prohibited. You've got it. We don't want anything to do with nuclear weapons. And I wanted to share with you some of what for me was exhilarating, happy news about nuclear weapons news. It had to do with the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that has become a passion of mine. And just a short while ago, we celebrated the 3rd anniversary. And that was all of 9 days ago. And that was a wonderful event. But let's talk more about where this came from. So next slide, please. I think you would probably recognize not only this picture, especially given our audience, but the photo behind me. And I'm not sure if you could actually see what that photo is, if you could enlarge it on the screen. Anybody want to guess what it is? These days, it could be Gaza or it could be Ukraine. But what it is an actual photo of Hiroshima. And notice what's totally missing in this photo. Besides all the buildings that got knocked down.
Vegetation.
Vegetation, what else?
People.
People, exactly. Okay. And why, as people, we have a good question to ask. What's so bad about nuclear weapons? What's the big deal? Why are they so destructive and horrible? And you're hearing all these adjectives that we're using. So what's so bad about them?
The damage is still going on today.
Okay, continuous damage. Okay, what else? What happens to a person?
Oh, their genes are mutated.
Their genes are mutated, right? If they live.
Yes.
If you're at ground zero, that's the best place to be in ground zero. You don't even turn into dust, you turn into a shadow. And as the radiation expands and the fireball starts, well, you might be in the area where the temperature is equivalent to the temperature on the sun. Your body doesn't withstand that too well, so your skin starts to melt, literally drip off your body. So your eyeballs fall out because the connection no longer works. You don't live too long because you're burned to death in a very, very gruesome way.
Joanne, Alpana raised her hand. I see.
Yes, Apana?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was just researching to talk to Pramila Jaipal regarding the the war and how to end it. So I was researching, educating myself, and then I find the people who are affected with these bombs, they are like for 10 years, decades after if the ladies are pregnant, their children get affected.
Absolutely.
Even though they were not, the children did not, they were not in that period of time, but the effect of those bombs remains in your body and your system, that the children are born, they are disabled, some
Exactly.
kind. So it is so horrible thing that it does not even goes, it remains from one decade to another. So that's the thing that I wanted to explain her, because, and that's why I studied all that. So it was a horrible thing, and we really need to work all together to remove it.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's very, very accurate. Matter of fact, it's not only one generation, it is the second generation that we're hearing from, and there's still the impact. And so we hear about and think about and usually only have an image of the physical damage, because that's what people talk about, right? And that's what they show on oftentimes in movies and things. But the people who have been promoting the treaty talked about the damage to humanity, the personal damage, and that don't ever think about nuclear weapons, don't ever think about war without thinking the cruelty of being the victim. And most of us, if you talk about nuclear weapons, if people have studied it all that they'll probably remember Hiroshima, maybe Nagasaki, probably never heard of the Trinity test before that. But it's not in anybody's consciousness that there were 2,000 times that we tested weapons, over 2,000 times. And the we is the group of 9 nations that have them, and you can see them spelled out here. And of course, the fact that North Korea has it now, and you heard the effects on the people of South Korea and the issue of deterrence. And I want to raise that because there's some new thinking about this issue of deterrence. If we could have the next slide. One of the areas that got personally affected by Americans, and since we are in the United States, I'd like to tell you about them. I never knew until I got into this, of the place called Castle Bravo. And it's one of the islands in the island chain of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Now, interestingly enough, how did the United States ever get involved in the Marshall Islands? Well, I'm not sure if you're familiar with what a trust territory is, but at the end of World War II, there were areas under the control of those countries that were losing, hence Germany and Italy for a while, and Japan. And those areas no longer, because they lost the war, they lost the control of their colonial areas. And that included the Marshall Islands. Well, this became an opportunity under the UN auspices to become a trust country. Take the colony under your wing and help them reach a more permanent state, because they are no longer in a colonial way attached to their former oppressor. So the United States did that with the Marshall Islands. And when they report in to the Trusteeship Council, it was at the Trusteeship Council that permission was given to the United States to use the Marshall Islands as a test site. And the expression was for the good of mankind. Well, good meant we're going to be nice and strong, and that's how we're going to keep things good. It was certainly not good for the Marshallese people. This was the largest explosion that was conducted in the Marshall Islands. It was 1,000 times the intensity of Hiroshima. And it was on an island called Bikini, and Bikini gained fame because that's where the island, that's who the victim island was. Let's go with the next slide. But there were people that were not happy with this. People within the peace community and countries that were not happy with this. And that expression came from the deliberations that went on when they finally, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that led to a treaty a few years later called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And every 5 years, the countries that signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that was 191 nations, this was seen as a very successful treaty. The countries that signed that treaty said, we promise that if we have weapons, we'll work to eliminate them. And if we don't have weapons, you just stay in that state, please. And to some extent, when you stop to think of 193 nations, only 9 nations having nuclear weapons is on the positive side. I mean, there could be a lot more. But we're out to see if we can stop those 9 nations. And voices rose within one of these meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were 40 countries that said, hey, you guys that have these weapons, why don't you follow through on your promise and eliminate them? And so a group called the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons saw this as an opportunity and met with those 40 countries and introduced them to people like Peter Moore, who brought the message from the Red Cross that it's the human effect that you have to think of. Don't think about the power of the weapon. Think of the human effect that it has. And that is going to perpetuate, together with the words of Pope Francis. And that's exactly what happened. It led to the creation of the impossible, which was a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons. And by 2017, after the persistence of ICAN, this international committee, they won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, the treaty opened up for signature. To those people who have worked on disarmament, this was a high point. It was the highest point of their career, that now nuclear weapons were illegal. Let's take the next slide. And the provisions of the treaty were extremely thorough because they tried to copy the provisions of a chemical weapons treaty that after 70 years actually worked. We finally eliminated our chemical weapons. Well, if something worked in the field of weapons of mass destruction, do the same thing. So that's exactly what the writer did here. So there's a whole array of verbs that when a country signs, then ratifies the treaty, that country agrees to see what applies to that country and to do it, to enforce the treaty. So this is the good news that I wanted to share with you. Next slide, please. To this day, we're up to 70 now. I didn't realize from the time that we actually showed the slide the first time, I didn't get a chance to correct it, but we're 70 because Sao Paulo and Principe came on. board as a country. But there are now 69 countries that ratified the treaty. When you sign a treaty, there are 28 additional countries that have signed the treaty. When you first sign the treaty, you say we're interested. But then you have to bring that interest back to your home country if you're the ambassador from the UN. And you have to see, are we willing to sign into it and adopt it as our own legislation? That means enforce it. Not just say it's a good thing, but actually do what you're supposed to do in the ratification of the treaty. So once that happened, and next slide, please. Once that happened, and on 3 years ago and 9 days ago, the treaty came into force. Then it falls into the hands not only of ICANN, but also the disarmament groups at the United Nations. And in their typical UN fashion, they'll bring together those people who have signed the treaty. Why? Because you have to look and see what applies to us. And if you're sitting down with all these other countries that are in the same situation, you can talk to each other. Well, yeah, this pertains to us, but this doesn't. And how are you doing if we're meeting the same problem? So the Austrian ambassador said that he would be willing to have the first meeting of the states parties. And there was a second meeting that was held of the states parties this past November, and I had a chance to go at that meeting. Next slide, please. In wonderful fashion for the UN, of course, they were going to choose the exact same place where some of the evils of expansion of nuclear weapons took place. It's the same trusteeship council where we told you the US got okay, and so did France, and so did Great Britain. Russia was not part of the trusteeship council, I don't think, at that time. So anyway, they use the same room for the countries. You'll see over here that those were the countries that had signed the treaty, but there were going to be 35 additional countries that had joined because they're interested in hearing what these countries are doing. The most exciting part was that they're representatives of 700 civil organizations. And suddenly I was a part of a Rotary group that was there, but there were people from unions with thousands of members, people from all kinds of professional groups. They all cared about nuclear weapons one way or the other, whether they were involved in advocating on their behalf or treating the victims of nuclear weapons, even though it's years after their use. So they were there all on the same tune. We all supported the treaty. There were student groups, and it was wonderful to see I was thinking there were about 1,000 people there. There must have been easily 100 high school and college students, which was absolutely wonderful to see them. And they were participants. Some of these third generation students, like students from the Marshall Islands and students from Australian groups where the British had tested, or students from the French groups. These are all young people now who are advocating on behalf of, listen to what happened to us when we really had firsthand exposure. So the victims of these nuclear tests in 26 communities were supported by 45 allied organizations. I have to tell you, New York was in her glory. There were 65 events outside of at least the 50 events at the UN. New York really, really did her job in welcoming people and in expanding the 700 people that were there to a much larger New York group. Okay, next one, please. The outcome of the meeting was, first of all, this whole idea of deterrence has not worked. And people have used deterrence as a reason to get more weapons. It is not working. It is not stopping war. The weapons are so big that we have held off in using them purposely because we know how damaging they are. And so this was one of the issues, that deterrence is the problem. And so we're encouraging any country that's considering nuclear weapons, look, what is it really going to deter what? Another war? It hasn't. So that became a very strong point of this. They had a scientific advisory group that was helping specifically, how do you enforce? You know, you take the verbs and what do the verbs actually mean when you enforce them? This is the first treaty that actually cared about human beings, and they make sure that people who were victims in the testing situation, obviously, as well as any victims, and if a nuclear weapon were used, but we do have the victims of the tests, and they're still suffering the consequences. And they were delighted by how much the talk was going on between the countries. So let's move on to the next slide. So things were so positive and so exciting and so electric when you got a final report that was unanimously agreed upon. Every single provision of that final resolution was agreed upon. And that was truly exciting. So it was such a wonderful experience that the deciders just made the decision that we should go back to the UN and back to New York because we had a good time here. And I think they appreciated us being here. So the next one is going to take place in 2025, and Kazakhstan, who has taken intense leadership in getting rid of the Russian weapons and also making sure that test bans no longer occur, or testing no longer occurs, because they were victims of the Russian tests. This is the same slide, except slightly readapted, that Gu presented to us. I think if you see it spelled out this way, you realize what our role has been. And this was from 2019. Guess what? Each year since then are 35, and that's only one year's worth of spending on nuclear weapons. If I show you the next slide, you'll see how that has gone up for the US. For 2022, the total global spending is 82 billion, and for the US, it went up from 37 to 43 billion. Both sides in our legislature love to fund nuclear weapons even more than the military. I don't think most people realize that. But how can we move this money? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joanne. So does anybody know why health professionals might care about nuclear weapons?
It goes way back to the 1970s and 1980s.
But why?
Well, if there were ever the use of a nuclear weapon, you know, the health facilities would not even be able to function, you know, I mean, they would be totally eviscerated. So, you know, yeah, that's what I would assume then.
Exactly. Alpina.
Yeah, to stop the generational effect of the diseases that occurs through atomic war. And the studies has been done, and it has been clear that while they test at that period of time till today's date, those families who were there, they are affected, and they're still suffering with many diseases inside. And some of them who were very young and they had children, their children also are affected with those bombs. So that could be the reason the physicians, some of the group of physicians thought about, you know, it's a generational damage to our society. So to stop that, they probably raised that. I'm just guessing because it's long ago it happened.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. Mary, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that my memory of it is that to be a doctor, you have to be committed to treating and or curing illness. And because the nuclear weapons are omnicidal, not just genocidal, omnicidal.
Mhm.
There is no cure. There is no cure. The hospitals will all be destroyed. So even, and the size of the bombs now is so much bigger than even way bigger than what was used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So if there is a nuclear war, there's no way to treat or cure. So the only thing that can be done is to prevent. And that's
Absolutely.
my memory for PSR is you have to prevent it.
Exactly. We have to prevent what we can't treat. So PSR, Physicians for Social Responsibility, formed on a national level, and then went around the country and formed, many statewide chapters, of which, we have the Washington chapter here.
80%. The Red Cross was there 3 weeks after the bomb in Hiroshima, and they had established the fact that 80% of the entire medical corps, we're talking about hospitals and physicians, were totally destroyed. So there was, medical help was impossible.
Exactly. The medical consequences of nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, nuclear production are extreme. There's multi-generational effects. I'm talking 2-3 generations down the line. There's actually an altering of DNA that happens when you're exposed to that level of ionizing radiation. And the picture above, here's a victim of the testing in the Marshall Islands, and then on the right, this is somebody who, whose mother was pregnant with him when the testing occurred in Kazakhstan. He's born, blind and disfigured.
They call them bubble babies in the Marshall Islands because the children were born without any skeletons.
Yeah. And Joanne mentioned earlier, right? Like, those closest to the epicenter were literally turned into shadows. This is a picture of one of those shadows. And those people were lucky, right? Like, people who were farther out, they were described by survivors as ghosts, and they were described as ghosts because their skin was hanging off their bodies. So we know these things are horrible. And now we're breaking into the ideology of deterrence, right? It's a flawed ideology. We no longer have nuclear arms control treaties, which we've had in the past. I think those largely prevented the consequences of nuclear war. And the federal government wants to spend upwards of $2 trillion to modernize and enhance the entire arsenal. So what we're doing here is we're bringing together the peace movement, the climate movement, really anybody who, wants to live on this planet, and not just out of a sense of fear, but understanding that, if we redirect this money, we can have a peaceful society that values medicine, that values housing, that values human dignity over death and destruction. So one thing we ask our supporters to do is we have a petition that lays out steps to abolition, steps to disarm, and it's not going to happen overnight. We need bilateral treaties. We need multilateral treaties. We need to start phasing out the low-hanging fruit, like the Sentinel program, like the missiles in the center of our country that can only be used as a first strike weapon, are really have no defensive capabilities because our supposed adversaries know exactly where they are. These are steps we can take. These are steps that our members of Congress need to take. In Washington State, except for Pramila Jayapal, our members of Congress are not backing legislation that would accomplish this. So that's the role of our coalition, is we need to get them to see the light. So by circulating this petition, we're growing our base. We're also working on passing resolutions on the local level. Yesterday I was at Seattle City Council where we, attempted to speak directly to those council members during public comment. We're trying to contact, we're trying to lobby, do what we can to get these local resolutions passed. These resolutions would not just call on Congress to act. We want to put some teeth into it, like the folks in Spokane, and pass something that has a financial impact on the companies that are pushing for this rebuild. So we want to call on our cities to divest any public funds from the companies that produce nuclear weapons and other weapons of war.
ICANN has come out with a publication that lists the companies that actually make the weapons. So if you have a financial advisor and you happen to have stock in those, you can know what to divest from. And so that's another thing that personally you could do.
Absolutely. Another priority of ours is we have to combat the erasure of people who've been exposed to nuclear weapons. The first step to that, beyond acknowledging the impacts, acknowledging, our Marshallese brothers and sisters, that are living in our state, we got to fight for the benefits that they need. They've been cut out of, basic, they need a lot of healthcare to deal with those multi-generational effects. We can provide that healthcare. There's legislation that does that. We support the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for folks who are downwind of nuclear tests. We support the Compact Impact Fairness Act to support folks from the South Pacific. This is really essential to our work and to bring in folks with that direct lived experience into the movement. So folks can go to that link or use the QR code to send a letter to your member of Congress.
Sean, I was advocating for a Radiation Compensation Act, directly talking with the legislatures, and also wrote a couple of, and I need some, I think.
Yeah.
Need.
Can we wait to, I'm almost done. We can just wait to the end.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
The other key thing that happened, during the nuclear freeze movement during the 1980s, when we actually got the US and Russia to stop producing nuclear weapons, to freeze their arms race, is that millions of people were in the street. There was a mass movement. That is another key role of our coalition, is to recreate the movement. However, we don't want to just focus on the imminent threat of death and destruction of nuclear weapons. Frankly, people today have a lot of those threats hanging over their heads. Poverty, climate change. It's not a sustainable motivator. What we need to do is talk about how we can better use these funds for a positive vision of civil society. So on tax day this April, we're asking all of our supporters to join a demonstration in your congressional district about moving the money from tax day to human needs, or tax day to Earth Day. How can we spend this money instead on addressing the other pressing crisis of our time, which is climate change? $2 trillion it's a lot of money. It could go a long way to helping people. All we have to do is give up some old dusty missiles. And we can go to questions now. Thanks, folks. Alpin, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you are in the middle of the, I thought you ended. Anyway.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah,